Hey everyone, today we're talking about one of the most incredible battles in history, the Battle of Didgori. This was a game-changing moment for Georgia, where a much smaller but highly trained Georgian army took on a massive Muslim coalition. The odds were against them, but what happened next was unbelievable. So, here's what led to this battle. Muslim merchants from Tbilisi, Ganja, and Dmanisi were unhappy with how things were going, so they complained to Sultan Mahmud II of Baghdad. In response, the Sultan sent a huge army led by Ilghazi ibn Artuk, a famous military leader. Ilghazi had already defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Ager Sanguinis, and now he was bringing together warriors from different regions, including Aran, Divin, Al-Hilla, and Nakhichevan, along with nomadic Arab fighters. This wasn't just a raid, it was an all-out invasion. Historians disagree on how big Ilghazi's army really was. Some old records claim it was as large as 600,000 soldiers, but modern estimates put it between 100,000 and 250,000. Either way, they heavily outnumbered the Georgians. By the summer of 1121, they were marching into Georgia, ready for battle. Meanwhile, King David IV of Georgia had been preparing for this moment for years. He had completely reformed his military, creating a disciplined, well-trained force. By 1118, he had built up an elite royal guard called the Mona Spa, made up of mercenaries and noble warriors. When the time came to fight, David had 56,000 troops, including 500 Alans, 200 Franks, and 15,000 Kipchaks. David knew he was outnumbered, so he had to be smart. His army was set up in tight, well-organized groups, each led by experienced leaders. The strongest part of his force was his heavy cavalry, 5,000 elite warriors with lances and bows, trained to smash into enemy lines and attack over and over again. His Kipchak allies, known for their fast, deadly attacks, were ready to follow up and hit the enemy when they were weak. The Crusaders and some infantry guarded the center, while the rest of the army was hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ilghazi, confident in his huge numbers, didn't expect much trouble. His scouts rode ahead and saw what looked like a much smaller Georgian force. This made him overconfident. He sent cavalry to harass the Georgians with arrows and insults, but they didn't even flinch. Unlike Ilghazi's army, which was mostly light cavalry and archers, the Georgians had heavily armored knights who could break through enemy lines with sheer force. Ilghazi had no cavalry strong enough to match them. King David wasn't just a brilliant general, he was also a great leader who knew how to inspire his troops. Before the battle, he gave a speech to fire them up. He told them they were fighting for their faith and their homeland, and he made it clear that there was no turning back. He even had his men block the exits from the battlefield so no one could retreat. They were in this fight until the end. One of the biggest advantages the Georgians had was their alliance with the Kipchaks. These warriors had a long history of working with the Georgians, and were known for their incredible fighting skills. Years earlier, David had strengthened this alliance by marrying a Kipchak princess. In 1109, after losing battles against the Rus, 40,000 Kipchaks fled to Georgia, where David welcomed them, gave them land, and made them part of his army. In return, every Kipchak family had to provide one soldier, helping David build a permanent army. Another key part of David's forces was the Franks, European knights who had come to fight alongside him. Some records say there were 100 of them, others say 200, but either way, they played a big role. These heavily armored warriors were placed at the front lines to lead powerful charges. It's unclear whether they were sent by a European ruler or if they were mercenaries, but one thing is certain, they fought as allies against a common enemy. This battle wasn't just about numbers. It was about strategy, discipline, and having the better plan. Even though the Georgians were heavily outnumbered, they were better trained and better organized. And when the battle finally started, what happened next was nothing short of incredible. And King David knew he couldn't let Ilghazi link up with the Muslim forces in Tbilisi. If that happened, Georgia's chances of victory would shrink drastically. So, he decided to strike first. Instead of meeting the enemy in open battle, he set up an ambush in the rugged terrain near the Didgori mountains. It was a perfect place for his plan, a narrow wooded area where his smaller army could control the fight. On August 11, 1121, David led his troops through the Nichbisi Valley, coming from Georgia's ancient capital, Mutskheta. He divided his army into two groups, one under his direct command and another, smaller force, hidden behind the hills under his son, Demetrius Asi. They were waiting for the right moment to attack the enemy's flank. Historical records describe the battle differently, but one thing is clear: David used deception to his advantage. According to the Arab chronicler, Ibn al-Athir, the Georgians sent a small group of Kipchak warriors toward the enemy, pretending to negotiate. Ilghazi's men believed these warriors were deserters, seeking protection. This mistake proved fatal. Once they got close, the deserters suddenly turned on the Seljuk commanders, firing arrows and cutting them down. Chaos spread through the enemy camp before the battle had even properly begun. At the same time, David launched a frontal assault with his heavily armored cavalry, including the Crusader knights in his ranks. Their charge smashed into the Seljuk vanguard, forcing their archers into hand-to-hand combat, a situation they were completely unprepared for. This sudden and brutal attack threw the entire Seljuk force into disorder. Then, from the western slopes, the Georgian army surged forward, tightening the trap. Ilghazi himself barely survived. Wounded and unable to regain control of the battle, he and his son-in-law fled, leaving their army leaderless. Many of his commanders had been killed in the ambush, and without direction, the Seljuk troops panicked. Seeing their chance, King David personally led the charge on the right flank, sending his elite cavalry straight into the struggling enemy forces. Moving downhill, the Georgian horsemen hit with unstoppable force, breaking the Seljuk left flank. At the same time, Demetrius and his hidden troops struck from the other side. Now attacked from the front, the sides and the rear, the Seljuk army collapsed. Thousands tried to escape, but there was nowhere to run. Georgian infantry closed in, cutting down anyone who resisted. Kipchak horsemen joined the pursuit, making sure the enemy had no chance to regroup. For 3 days, the Georgians hunted down the fleeing Seljuk soldiers, leaving their bodies scattered across the valleys and rivers of the Manglisi region. One chronicler, Matthew of Edessa, described the aftermath as a terrible and savage slaughter. The Seljuk army had been wiped out. Within just 3 hours, the battle was over, and Georgia had won a victory that would shape its future. With Ilghazi's forces destroyed, King David had a clear path to reclaiming the region. He didn't stop at Didgori. The next year, he laid siege to Tbilisi and took the city, making it the capital of Georgia. The Muslim rule in the area was over. Some medieval accounts claim David took revenge on the city's Muslim population, while others, like the Arab historian Al-Aini, suggest he eventually showed tolerance. He abolished taxes on Muslims and Jews, and even protected Sufi scholars. Regardless of the exact details, his victory transformed Georgia into a dominant power in the region. For Ilghazi, the defeat at Didgori was devastating. Wounded and broken, he returned to Mardin in disgrace. His dream of conquering Georgia had ended in disaster. The defeat also gave breathing room to the Crusader states, as one of their biggest threats had been crippled. The Battle of Didgori wasn't just another victory, it became legendary. One Georgian chronicler even compared it to the great battles of ancient history, saying, "What are the stories of Achilles or Alexander to me when I have seen the wonders of this day?" It was more than just a military success. It was the moment Georgia cemented itself as a major power in the medieval world.